Please subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Moving to Oakhaven was supposed to be a fresh start. After the incident with my ex, I needed a change of scenery, a place where I could rebuild, find some peace. This small town, nestled between rolling hills and a sprawling forest, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. Quaint, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. Or so I thought. The house itself was a big part of the appeal. An old Victorian, a little run down, but full of character. It had a wide porch, creaky floorboards, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but it felt right, like a place where I could finally feel at home. I'd spent the last few weeks painting, cleaning, and unpacking, trying to make it my own, trying to erase the shadows of the past and fill the space with, well, with me. The first few nights were uneventful, peaceful even. I slept soundly, the quiet of the countryside a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. But then, slowly, subtly, things started to change. It started with whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling through the leaves outside my window. But the whispers seemed closer, inside the house. I'd be reading a book in the living room or cooking dinner in the kitchen, and I'd hear it. A faint murmuring sound like someone whispering just out of earshot. I'd stop what I was doing, listening intently, but the sound would always fade away, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. Then came the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, fleeting movements in the periphery of my vision. A dark shape flitting across a doorway, a shadow flickering in a darkened hallway. I'd turn to look, but there would be nothing there. Just empty space. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, stressed from the move, from everything. But the incidents became more frequent, more pronounced. One evening, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard a distinct sound, like someone dragging a heavy object across the floor above me. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding, but it didn't happen again. I went upstairs, checking each room, but everything was in its place. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Another night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the window. Tap, 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 like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I got out of bed and cautiously approached the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the empty garden, bathed in the pale moonlight. I started to feel jumpy, uneasy, like I was being watched. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking the locks on the doors and windows, even though I knew, logically, that there was nothing to be afraid of. Oakhaven was a safe town, a quiet town. Nothing bad ever happened here. But the whispers continued, the shadows persisted, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. I started to doubt my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Was it just stress, playing tricks on my mind? Or was something else going on? One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, trying to relax, to enjoy the sunshine, when I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it was clearer, closer. It seemed to be coming from inside the house. I got up, my heart pounding, and slowly walked back inside. The whispering grew louder as I approached the living room. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, murmuring softly, unintelligibly. I stood in the doorway of the living room, listening, my body tensed, ready to, I don't know, run, scream, fight, but there was nothing to fight. The room was empty. The whispering stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold, creeping feeling of dread. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't stress. Something was happening in this house. Something strange. Something unnatural. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I needed help. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking, and dialed the local police department. The number was on a flyer I'd received when I moved in. A welcome to Oakhaven packet filled with information about the town. A calm, male voice answered. Oakhaven Police Department, Officer Harris speaking. Hello, I said, my voice trembling. I need to report something. Something strange. I explained, as best I could, what had been happening. The whispers, the shadows, the unsettling noises. I felt ridiculous, like I was describing a scene from a bad horror movie. I expected the officer to dismiss me, to tell me it was just my imagination, to hang up. But he didn't. He listened patiently, asking questions, taking notes. He sounded concerned. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. I'm going to come over and take a look around. Just stay where you are, and I'll be there as soon as I can. His name was Officer Daniel Harris, and he arrived at my house about 20 minutes later. He was a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. He introduced himself and asked me to show him around the house. I led him through each room, pointing out the places where I had heard the whispers, seen the shadows, experienced the unsettling noises. He listened attentively, his expression serious, but he didn't say much. He examined the doors and windows, checking the locks, looking for any signs of forced entry. He found nothing. We ended up in the living room, the place where I had heard the clearest whispers. Officer Harris stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something. I don't see anything out of the ordinary, Ms. Thompson, he said, his voice calm but firm. There's no sign of anyone having been in the house. No signs of anything unusual. I knew it. I knew he wouldn't believe me. I knew he would think I was crazy. But I heard them, I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. The whispers, the shadows. I'm not making this up. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. He didn't say it, but I could see it in his expression. He thought I was imagining things. He thought I was unstable, Ms. Thompson, he said gently. I understand you're feeling uneasy. Moving to a new place can be stressful, and you mentioned you've been through a difficult time recently. He was referring to the incident with my ex, the information I had reluctantly shared with him when he asked if I had any reason to believe someone might be trying to harass me. This isn't about that, I said, my voice shaking. This is something else. Something I can't explain. He sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Look, Miss Thompson, he said. I'm not saying you're not experiencing something, but I can't find any evidence of anything criminal, anything tangible. He paused, then added, Maybe you should talk to someone. A therapist, perhaps, someone who can help you process what you're going through. I felt a surge of anger, of frustration. He wasn't taking me seriously. He was dismissing me, writing me off as a hysterical woman. I'm not crazy, officer, I said, my voice tight with emotion. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Something is happening in this house. Something wrong. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly. Okay, Miss Thompson, he said. I'll tell you what. I'll keep an eye on the house. I'll have a patrol car drive by regularly, just to check things out. And if you experience anything else, anything at all, you call me. Directly. Here's my card. He handed me a business card with his name and cell phone number. I took it, my hand still shaking. Thank you, officer, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a faint, reassuring smile. Just try to relax, Ms. Thompson, he said. You're safe here. Oakhaven is a quiet town. Nothing bad ever happens here. He left, and I stood there, alone in the living room, the silence of the house pressing in on me. His words, meant to be comforting, echoed in my mind, filled with a chilling irony. because I knew, deep down, that he was wrong. Something was happening here, something bad, and I was right in the middle of it. The mysteries were just beginning, and I had a feeling they were going to get a lot worse before they got any better. The quiet town, the fresh start, it was all a facade. And the shadows in my house were only the first sign of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Back at the station, the call from Emma Thompson lingered in my mind. It wasn't the content of her complaint, exactly. Disturbances, strange noises. Those were fairly common calls, especially in an older town like Oakhaven, with its share of creaky houses and overactive imaginations. It was her demeanor. She'd sounded genuinely terrified, not just spooked, but deeply, profoundly unsettled. And there was a fragility about her, a vulnerability that made me want to help, even if I was 99% sure it was all in her head. I relayed the details of the call to my partner, Officer Laura Miller. Laura was a few years older than me, seasoned, and a lot more skeptical. She'd been on the force long enough to see just about everything, and she had a knack for separating the genuine emergencies from the less genuine ones. "Sounds like a classic case of the new house jitters," Laura said, leaning back in her chair, a coffee cup in her hand. "Old house, creaky floors, strange sounds. It's all par for the course. Add in a recent personal trauma, and you've got a recipe for an overactive imagination." "Maybe," I conceded. But she seemed genuinely scared, Laura. Not just jumpy, but deeply afraid. And she was adamant that it wasn't just her imagination. Laura raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "They always are, Danny. They always are." I know, I said. "But I don't know. Something about this one felt different." I gave her my card, told her to call me directly if anything else happened. Laura shrugged. "Can't hurt. Keep an eye on it, but don't get too invested. Chances are, it'll all blow over in a few days." Despite Laura's skepticism, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Emma Thompson's story. I decided to do a little digging, just to satisfy my own curiosity. I pulled up the property records for her address, checking for any previous reports, any history of disturbances. The records showed that the house was old, built in the late 1800s. It had changed hands several times over the years, with no significant incidents reported. No burglaries, no violent crimes, nothing that would suggest anything unusual. Still, I felt a nagging sense of unease. I decided to take Laura's advice, at least in part. We would keep an eye on the house. Not a full-blown surveillance, just regular patrols, checking in on Ms. Thompson, making sure she was okay. The next few days were quiet. No calls from Emma, no reports of any disturbances. I started to think that maybe Laura was right, that it had just been a case of nerves, of an overactive imagination. Then, on the third day, Emma called again. Her voice was even more frantic than before, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of fear. "It's happening again," she said, her voice trembling. "The whispering, the shadows. It's worse than before." "Calm down, Ms. Thompson," I said, trying to keep my voice soothing and reassuring. "Tell me what's happening." She described a series of increasingly disturbing events. Objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing, disembodied voices, whispering her name. It sounded fantastical, like something out of a ghost story. "I'll be right there," I said, grabbing my keys. "Just stay where you are, and don't open the door for anyone." I drove to her house, my mind racing. Was she exaggerating? Was she hallucinating? Or was something genuinely unnatural going on? When I arrived, I found Emma sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with terror. She looked even paler than before, her face drawn and haggard. "He's in there," she whispered, pointing towards the house. "I heard him. He's talking to me." "Who, Ms. Thompson?" I asked gently. "Who's talking to you?" I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not human. It's something else." I took a deep breath and entered the house, my hand resting on my holster. I wasn't expecting to find a person, but I didn't know what I was expecting. The house was silent, still. I moved through each room, checking every corner, every closet, every hiding place. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything being there. But as I stood in the living room, the same room where Emma had reported hearing the clearest whispers, I felt it, a cold spot, a sudden drop in temperature, as if a chill wind had blown through the closed room. And I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmuring sound, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I froze, listening intently. The whispering continued, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unsettling, unnerving, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical explanation for what I was hearing, for what I was feeling. But I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that Emma Thompson wasn't imagining things. Something was happening in this house. Something strange. Something beyond my understanding. I went back outside, finding Emma still huddled on the porch. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I couldn't tell her what I had heard, what I had felt. It would only frighten her more, and besides, I didn't even know what it was. "No, Ms. Thompson," I said, forcing a reassuring smile. "I didn't find anything. But I believe you. I believe something's going on." Her eyes widened, a flicker of relief in their depths. You do?" "Yes," I said. "I do, and I'm going to find out what it is." I called Laura, explaining the situation, my voice conveying the urgency I felt. She was still skeptical, but she agreed to meet me at the station. We needed to do more, to dig deeper, to find out what was really happening in that house. We spent the rest of the evening researching, poring over old records, searching for any clue, any hint of what might be causing the disturbances. We discovered that the house had a history, a dark history, filled with rumors of tragedy and unexplained events. Stories of a family that had lived there generations ago, a family that had been plagued by misfortune, by whispers of madness and something else, something darker, something supernatural. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was terrifying. We were dealing with something far beyond our experience, far beyond our understanding. We were dealing with something that defied logic, that challenged our beliefs, that threatened to shatter the quiet, peaceful facade of Oak Haven, and we were just beginning to scratch the surface. The initial investigation had led us to a precipice, a point of no return, where the mundane reality we knew was blurring with something ancient, something sinister, something that had been waiting, patiently, in the shadows, for its chance to return. The more Daniel and I dug into the history of Emma Thompson's house, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the usual small-town gossip and rumors. There were documented accounts of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and even a couple of sudden, unexpected incidents involving previous residents. Nothing concrete, nothing that pointed definitively to anything supernatural, but enough to raise red flags, enough to make even a skeptic like me start to wonder. Daniel was definitely leaning towards the something unexplained is happening theory. He'd experienced something in the house, that cold spot, and the whispering, and it had clearly shaken him. I, on the other hand, was still trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe a hidden passage? Some kind of elaborate prank? I wasn't ready to jump to ghosts and ghouls just yet, but I was ready to take Emma Thompson's claims seriously. She was genuinely terrified, and that wasn't something I could ignore. We decided to increase our patrols around her house, and I offered to stay with her for a night, just to observe, to see if I could experience anything firsthand. Daniel wasn't thrilled with the idea, worried about my safety, but he agreed. That evening, I arrived at Emma's house armed with a thermos of coffee, a notepad, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Emma was clearly relieved to see me, her face etched with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She'd been jumping at every creak and groan of the old house, and I could tell she was on the verge of a breakdown. We spent the early part of the evening talking. Emma reiterated her experiences, the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. She also talked about her past, about the difficult relationship she'd escaped, about her desire for a fresh start in Oakhaven. She seemed vulnerable, yes, but also intelligent and articulate. Not the type to fabricate stories or imagine things. As the night wore on, the house remained quiet. Too quiet. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, it was all in her head. Maybe the stress and anxiety were manifesting as these perceived phenomena. Then, around midnight, I decided to explore the attic. Emma hadn't been up there yet, she said. It was full of old junk, boxes, and discarded furniture, left behind by the previous owners. She'd been avoiding it, understandably. The attic was dusty and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs, forgotten relics, and stacks of dusty boxes. It was like stepping back in time, a glimpse into the lives of the people who had lived in this house before. In a far corner, partially hidden beneath a tattered tapestry, I spotted a small wooden chest. It was old, its wood darkened with age, its metal hinges rusted. I knelt down and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed lace and faded photographs, was a book, a diary. I pulled it out, my heart beating a little faster. The diary was bound in leather, its pages brittle and discolored. The handwriting on the cover was faded, but I could just make out the name, Eleanor Ainsworth, and a date, 1898. I carefully opened the diary, its pages whispering as I turned them. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, the words meticulously recorded. Eleanor Ainsworth, I quickly gathered, was a young woman who had lived in this house over a century ago. Her entries described her daily life, her hopes, her dreams, her fears. And, as I read further, her entries began to describe other things, strange things, things that mirrored, with unsettling accuracy, the experiences Emma Thompson was reporting. Eleanor wrote of whispers in the night, of shadows that moved on their own, of a feeling of being watched, of a growing sense of dread that permeated the house. She described objects moving, doors opening and closing, disembodied voices calling her name. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read Eleanor's words. It was as if I were reading Emma's story, but from a century ago. The similarities were too striking, too specific to be mere coincidence. Eleanor's entries became increasingly frantic, increasingly desperate. She wrote of a presence in the house, a dark, malevolent entity that was tormenting her, haunting her, driving her to the brink of madness. She wrote of trying to escape, to leave the house, but the presence wouldn't let her. It was trapped her. The final entry in the diary was abrupt, unfinished. It ended mid-sentence, as if Eleanor had been interrupted, as if something, or someone, had stopped her from writing. I closed the diary, my hand trembling. The air in the attic suddenly felt colder, heavier. I looked around, my flashlight beam darting across the dusty space, half expecting to see something. I quickly made my way back downstairs, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. I found Emma in the living room, sitting on the sofa, her eyes wide with apprehension. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What did you find?" I showed her the diary, explaining what I had discovered. As she read Eleanor's words, her face paled, her eyes widening in disbelief and terror. It's happening again," she whispered. "The same thing. It's happening again." The diary was a turning point. It was concrete evidence, a tangible link between the past and the present. It confirmed that Emma wasn't imagining things, that something truly unexplained was happening in this house. And it suggested that the history of Oakhaven, the history of this house, was far darker, far more sinister than anyone had imagined. We were no longer dealing with a simple case of new house jitters. We were dealing with something much deeper, something much more dangerous. The old diary had opened a door to the past, a past that was refusing to stay buried, a past that was reaching out, across the decades, to claim a new victim, and we were caught in the middle of it, with no idea how to stop it. The discovery of Eleanor Ainsworth's diary changed everything. It wasn't just Emma's word and Officer Harris's gut feeling anymore. We had tangible evidence linking the present disturbances to a dark past. The weight of that history settled heavily on us, especially after another sleepless night at Emma's house. She was understandably terrified, and honestly, I was starting to feel a creeping unease myself. The old house seemed to breathe with secrets, and I was determined to uncover them. The next morning, Daniel and I brought the diary to the station. We needed to verify its authenticity and delve deeper into the Ainsworth family history. Chief Robert Johnson, a man who usually seemed unflappable, looked genuinely concerned as he listened to our report. He was a longtime Oakhaven resident, a walking encyclopedia of local history, and he knew the Ainsworth name. The Ainsworth family, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. That's a name that hasn't been spoken in these parts for a long time. There were rumors, stories. Nothing ever proven, of course. He assigned us to continue the investigation, emphasizing the need for discretion. Oakhaven prided itself on its peaceful reputation, and he didn't want to stir up unnecessary panic. But he also recognized that something unusual was happening, and he gave us his full support. We spent the day researching, poring over old newspapers, town records, and historical documents. We confirmed that Eleanor Ainsworth had indeed lived in that house, and that she had disappeared without a trace in 1901. Her disappearance had been ruled a runaway case, but the rumors, the whispers, had persisted. Whispers of a dark secret, of a hidden tragedy, of something unnatural. As we were immersed in our research, a call came in from dispatch. A young woman had walked into the station claiming she had been kidnapped. Nothing unusual there, sadly. But it was what she was saying, the details she was providing, that made the dispatcher flag the case for immediate attention. Daniel and I rushed to the front desk. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, was sitting there, looking disoriented and confused. She was wearing clothes that looked strangely out of place. A long, old-fashioned dress, a shawl, shoes that looked like they belonged in a museum. "I'm Officer Miller," I said gently, approaching her. "And this is Officer Harris. Can you tell us your name?" She looked at me, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Sarah," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "Sarah White." "Okay, Sarah," I continued. "Can you tell us what happened? You said you were kidnapped?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. I was taken. I don't know how long ago. It was dark and cold, and there were voices." Her description sent a shiver down my spine. It echoed, with disturbing similarity, the accounts in Eleanor's diary. "Can you tell us where you were taken from, Sarah?" Daniel asked. "Do you remember anything about your surroundings?" Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It was a house," she said. "An old house, with a big garden, and a well. A deep, dark well." My heart skipped a beat. Emma's house had a large garden, and though I hadn't explored it thoroughly, I was almost certain there was an old well somewhere on the property. "Can you describe the house, Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "What did it look like?" Sarah began to describe the house, her words painting a vivid picture in my mind. She spoke of the wide porch, the creaky floorboards, the large windows, the ornate details. It was Emma's house. She was describing Emma's house. But there was something off. Something that didn't quite fit. Sarah was describing the house as it had been, decades ago. She mentioned details that had been altered or removed over the years. A stained glass window that had been broken and replaced, a gazebo in the garden that had long since collapsed, a particular pattern of wallpaper that had been covered over with layers of paint. It was as if she were describing the house from another time. "Sarah," I said slowly, "when do you think this happened? When were you taken?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with confusion. I don't know," she said. It was just a few days ago. I was walking home from the market, and then everything went dark." "What year is it, Sarah?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah blinked, her expression bewildered. 1923, she said. Of course. My blood ran cold. 1923? That was almost a century ago. Chief Johnson, who had been observing the interview from his office, stepped out, his face grim. Take her to a holding cell, he said, his voice low and urgent. Keep her comfortable, but don't let her out of your sight. We followed his orders, leading Sarah to a holding cell. She seemed compliant, almost resigned, as if she were used to being confined. As soon as she was secured, Chief Johnson pulled Daniel and me aside. This is bigger than we thought, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Much bigger. He explained that he recognized the name Sarah White. She was a local legend, a figure from Oakhaven's past, a young woman who had disappeared without a trace in 1923. It was impossible. It was insane. But there she was, sitting in a holding cell, claiming to be Sarah White, describing events that had happened almost a century ago. And then, as we were standing there, trying to make sense of the impossible, it happened again. A scream. A terrified, piercing scream coming from the holding cell. We rushed to the cell, our hearts pounding. But when we got there, the cell was empty. Sarah White was gone. She had vanished as suddenly and inexplicably as she had appeared, leaving us with more questions than answers, with a growing sense of dread, with the chilling realization that we were dealing with something far beyond our comprehension, something that was reaching out from the past, blurring the lines between reality and illusion, and threatening to engulf Oakhaven in a darkness it had long forgotten. The appearance of Sarah and her subsequent disappearance had shattered any remaining skepticism. We were dealing with something truly supernatural, and we were in way over our heads. Sarah White's vanishing act left us reeling. 1 minute she was there, a living, breathing paradox, a figure seemingly plucked from the past. The next, she was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her scream and a chilling void in the holding cell. It defied logic, defied explanation. It was as if the very fabric of reality had glitched. Daniel and I stood there, staring at the empty cell, trying to process what had just happened. Even Chief Johnson, a man who prided himself on his composure, looked shaken. He ordered a thorough search of the station, every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. But deep down, we all knew it was futile. Sarah hadn't escaped. She had disappeared. The immediate question, of course, was how. The holding cell was secure, the door locked, the window barred. There was no way she could have gotten out without assistance, and yet she was gone. The more pressing question, however, was why. Why had she appeared in the first place? And where had she gone? Was she a ghost? A time traveler? Some kind of projection? The possibilities were as terrifying as they were absurd. We reviewed the security footage, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But the footage only deepened the mystery. We saw Sarah sitting in the cell, looking anxious and disoriented. Then, suddenly, she flickered. Like a bad video signal, her image distorted, fragmented, and then vanished. There was no transition, no gradual fading, just gone. The footage was unsettling, to say the least. It offered no answers, only more questions. It confirmed that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something that defied the laws of physics, of reality itself. We decided to refocus our efforts on the one tangible link we had, Emma Thompson's house. Sarah had described the house in detail, details that only someone who had been there, intimately familiar with the place, could have known. And she had described it as it had been in 1923, confirming a connection to the past, to the same era, as Eleanor Ainsworth in her unsettling diary. We returned to Emma's house, this time with a renewed sense of urgency and a growing sense of dread. We explained the situation to Emma, carefully omitting the more bizarre details. We told her that we had found a witness who had corroborated her experiences, a witness who had described the house in detail. We didn't tell her that the witness claimed to be from 1923. Emma was understandably shaken, but also relieved. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. Someone else had experienced the same phenomena. Someone else had seen the things that she had seen. We decided to conduct a more thorough search of the house, focusing on the areas Sarah had mentioned, the garden and the well. We brought in a specialist team, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and other advanced detection equipment. We were looking for anything, any clue, any artifact, any evidence that might shed light on the mystery. The search of the garden yielded nothing unusual. The specialist confirmed the existence of the old well, but it was filled in, sealed decades ago. There was no sign of any recent disturbance, no indication that anything, or anyone, had been there. But then, as the team was packing up their equipment, one of the technicians called us over. He had been reviewing the radar data, and he had found something anomalous. "There's something under the house," he said, pointing to a blurry image on his monitor. A void, a space. It's not on any of the blueprints. It's like a hidden room. A hidden room. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be the key to the mystery? Could this be where Sarah White had been held? Could this be where Eleanor Ainsworth had disappeared? We located the approximate location of the hidden room based on the radar data. It was in the basement, beneath the area where Emma had reported hearing the whispers, where Daniel had felt the cold spot. We carefully examined the basement walls, searching for any sign of a hidden entrance. And then we found it. A section of the wall that was slightly different. The mortar was a different color, the bricks slightly misaligned. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. With a surge of adrenaline, we began to pry at the bricks, carefully removing them one by one. As we worked, the air grew colder, and we could hear a faint whispering sound, growing louder with each brick we removed. Finally, we had created a large enough opening to see inside. We shone our flashlights into the darkness, revealing a small stone chamber. It was empty, except for a few scattered objects, a rusted chain, a broken wooden stool, and a small, leather-bound book. It was another diary. I carefully reached into the chamber and retrieved the diary. The cover was blank, but as I opened it, I recognized the handwriting. It was the same elegant, flowing script as Eleanor Ainsworth's diary. But this diary was different. The first few entries were similar to Eleanor's, describing her daily life, her hopes, her dreams. But then, the entries began to change. They became darker, more frantic, more desperate. This diary, it seemed, chronicled the events after Eleanor's disappearance. It was written by her sister, Margaret. Margaret wrote of her search for Eleanor, of her growing suspicion that something unnatural had happened in the house. She wrote of her own experiences with the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, and she wrote of her discovery of a hidden room in the basement. A room where she believed Eleanor had been held captive. A room where she believed something evil resided. The final entry in Margaret's diary was chilling. She wrote of her decision to confront the entity, to try to save her sister, even if it meant sacrificing herself. She wrote of her plan to seal the room, to trap the entity inside, to prevent it from ever harming anyone again. And then the entry stopped, abruptly, in mid-sentence. The diary was a revelation. It confirmed our suspicions. It explained the connection between the past and the present. It revealed the true horror of what had happened in this house. But it also raised a terrifying question. If Margaret had sealed the room, trapping the entity inside, how had it gotten out? And what did it want with Emma? And with Sarah White? The search for answers had led us to a truth more horrifying than we could have imagined. And we were now facing a threat that was not only ancient and evil, but also free. The echoes of the past were no longer faint whispers. They were a deafening roar, a warning that the darkness had returned, and that Oakhaven was once again in its grip. Margaret Ainsworth's diary was a game-changer. It painted a chilling picture of the events that had transpired in Emma's house a century ago, a picture that directly correlated with the phenomena Emma was experiencing now. It was no longer just a case of unsettling occurrences. It was a confirmed haunting, a legacy of darkness passed down through generations. Officer Miller and I spent the next few hours poring over Margaret's diary, piecing together the fragmented narrative. Margaret, driven by the disappearance of her sister Eleanor, had become convinced that something sinister was lurking within the house. Her accounts of whispers, moving objects, and a pervasive sense of dread mirrored Eleanor's, and, terrifyingly, Emma's. But Margaret had gone further. She'd investigated. She'd confronted. The diary revealed a deeply unsettling truth. The Ainsworth family had a secret. A dark secret. They were involved in practices. Practices that were best left undisturbed. They had dabbled in things they didn't understand, opened doors that should have remained closed. And they had unleashed something evil. Margaret described the entity as a shadow, a presence, a being of darkness. She never gave it a name, but she described its effects with chilling clarity. It fed on fear, on despair, on life force. It could manipulate objects, influence thoughts, and take people. The hidden room in the basement, the room we had just discovered, was the epicenter of the entity's power. It was where Eleanor had been held, where she had vanished, and it was where Margaret had made her final, desperate stand. According to the diary, Margaret had devised a plan to contain the entity. She had researched ancient rituals, studied forgotten lore, and discovered a way to seal the room, to trap the entity inside, preventing it from escaping and harming anyone else. The final entry in the diary described Margaret's preparations for the ritual. She had gathered specific objects, inscribed protective symbols, and prepared a binding incantation. She knew it was dangerous, that she was risking her own life, but she was determined to protect others from the horror that had consumed her sister. The diary ended there, abruptly, leaving us with the chilling implication that Margaret had succeeded in sealing the room, but at a terrible cost. The question that haunted us now was, how had the room been unsealed? Had someone deliberately opened it? Had the seal weakened over time? Or had the entity found a way to break free? We decided to bring Emma back to the house. We needed to show her the diaries, to explain what we had discovered. We needed her to understand the danger she was in. We met her at the station, carefully explaining the situation, omitting the more gruesome details, but emphasizing the gravity of the situation. We showed her Eleanor's and Margaret's diaries, letting her read their words, letting her see the chilling parallels between their experiences and her own. Emma was, understandably, overwhelmed. She was pale, trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. "So, it's real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all real. The whispers, the shadows, the thing in the house. It's all real." "Yes, Emma," Officer Miller said gently. "It's real. But we're going to do everything we can to stop it, to protect you." We explained Margaret's plan, the ritual she had performed to seal the room. We told her that we believed the entity was still contained somehow within the house, but that it was growing stronger, that it was trying to break free. "We need your help, Emma," I said. "You're connected to this house, to this entity. You may be the only one who can stop it." Emma looked at us, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "What do I have to do?" she asked. We weren't sure. We didn't have all the answers, but we knew we had to start somewhere. We decided to return to the house, to re-examine the hidden room, to search for any clues that Margaret might have left behind. As we were preparing to leave, Officer Miller received a call. It was from the specialist team that had been analyzing the radar data from the house. "We found something else," the technician said, his voice urgent. "Something under the hidden room. Another void. A larger space. Another hidden room beneath the first one?" What was going on? We rushed back to Emma's house, our sense of urgency renewed. We returned to the basement, to the hidden room we had discovered earlier. We carefully examined the floor, searching for any sign of another entrance. And then we found it. A faint outline, barely visible in the stone floor. A trap door. With a surge of adrenaline, we heaved open the trap door, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the unknown. The air that rushed up from the opening was cold, stale, and carried with it a faint, unsettling whisper. We knew, with a chilling certainty, that we were about to descend into the heart of the darkness, into the place where the true horror of Oakhaven's past resided. And we had no idea what we would find there. The past had been revealed, but the present was about to become a nightmare. The layers of secrets were peeling away, one by one, exposing a truth far more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. And Emma, the unwitting inheritor of this dark legacy, was at the center of it all. The discovery of the second hidden room, the one beneath the already unsettling chamber, sent a wave of dread through us. The narrow, descending staircase, shrouded in darkness, felt like a gateway to something truly sinister. The faint whispers emanating from below were no longer subtle. They were distinct, chilling, and seemed to beckon us into the unknown. Officer Miller and I exchanged a look. We knew we had to go down there. We had to find out what was at the bottom of those stairs. But we also knew that we were stepping into something potentially dangerous, something far beyond our understanding. Emma, stay here, I said, my voice firm. We'll check it out. If anything happens, call for backup. Emma nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She was clearly terrified, but she also understood the gravity of the situation. She knew that her fate, and perhaps the fate of Oakhaven, was tied to whatever lay hidden beneath her house. Officer Miller and I descended the staircase slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by time and something else. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The staircase opened into a large, cavernous space. It was unlike anything we had seen before. It wasn't a room, not in the conventional sense. It was more like a natural cave, but with signs of modification. The walls were rough-hewn stone, but there were strange symbols carved into them, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift. In the flickering light of our flashlights, the floor was uneven, covered in a layer of dust and debris. And in the center of the cavern, there was a pit. A large, circular pit, its depths shrouded in darkness. The whispering seemed to be emanating from the pit, a chorus of voices, murmuring unintelligibly. We approached the pit cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. We shone our flashlights down into the darkness, but we couldn't see the bottom. It was as if the pit were bottomless. "What is this place?" Officer Miller whispered, her voice barely audible above the whispering. "I don't know," I said, my voice equally hushed. "But I don't like it." Suddenly, we heard a noise behind us, a soft, shuffling sound like someone or something moving. We whirled around, our flashlights sweeping across the cavern. But there was nothing there, just the shadows, dancing and shifting in the flickering light. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice tense. Officer Miller nodded, her hand resting on her weapon. "Yeah," she said. "Sounded like it came from the stairs." We turned back towards the staircase, our flashlights illuminating the narrow passage. And then we saw it. A figure, standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint light from the basement above. It was Emma. "Emma!" I shouted. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay upstairs." But Emma didn't respond. She just stood there, staring down at us, her expression blank, unreadable. And then she started to descend the stairs, slowly, deliberately, her movements unnatural, stiff, jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Emma?" Officer Miller said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Still, Emma didn't respond. She continued to descend, her eyes fixed on us, her expression unchanging. As she got closer, I noticed something different about her. Her eyes, they weren't red anymore. They were black, completely black, like empty sockets. And her skin, it was pale, almost translucent, like the skin of a corpse. This wasn't Emma, not anymore. "Stop right there!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavern. I raised my flashlight, shining it directly on her face. The light seemed to agitate her. She recoiled slightly, hissing, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine, and then she lunged. She moved with terrifying speed, her movements blurring, her hands outstretched, her fingers curled into claws. She was aiming for Officer Miller. I reacted instinctively, pushing Officer Miller out of the way, taking the brunt of the attack myself. Emma slammed into me, her body surprisingly strong, her nails raking across my arm, drawing a sharp, stinging pain. I never saw any liquid red. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, my flashlight clattering away, plunging us into near darkness. I could hear Officer Miller shouting, struggling with Emma, the sounds of their struggle echoing through the cavern. I scrambled to my feet, groping for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I found it, switched it on, and shone it on the scene before me. Officer Miller was wrestling with Emma, trying to restrain her, but Emma was fighting with a strength that was inhuman. Her eyes were wild, her face contorted in a snarl, her teeth bared. "It's not her, Daniel," Officer Miller shouted, her voice strained. "It's something else." I knew she was right. The Emma I knew was gone, replaced by this creature, this monster. Suddenly, Emma let out a piercing scream, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The cavern shook, the walls trembling, the whispering intensifying. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the struggle stopped. Emma went limp, collapsing to the ground, her body still. Officer Miller and I stared at her, our hearts pounding, our breaths ragged. We didn't know what had just happened. We didn't know if Emma was gone. Then with a gasp, Emma vanished, just like Sarah White had done. The room went silent. We were alone, and the search for Emma had to begin. We were alone, in the darkness, surrounded by the whispering, by the shadows, by the chilling presence of something ancient and evil. We had lost Emma, and we had no idea how to get her back. The descent into the second hidden room had been a descent into madness, a descent into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. And we were left with the terrifying realization that we were not just fighting a ghost, a haunting, but something far more powerful, far more sinister, something that could possess, control, and erase. The disappearance of Emma was not just a mystery, it was a declaration of war. And we were woefully unprepared. Emma's disappearance hit us hard. It was one thing to investigate strange occurrences, to read about historical accounts of hauntings, but to witness someone vanish before our eyes. That was a different level of horror. It shattered any remaining doubts we had about the supernatural nature of the events in Oakhaven. We were dealing with forces beyond our comprehension, forces that could defy the laws of physics and reality itself. We stumbled back up the stairs, out of that terrifying cavern, into the relative normalcy of the basement. Even the dusty, cluttered basement felt like a sanctuary compared to the oppressive darkness below. We immediately called for backup, reporting Emma's disappearance and requesting a full-scale search of the house and surrounding area. Chief Johnson arrived within minutes, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and fear. He listened to our account of what had happened, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is worse than I thought," he said, his voice low and serious. "Much worse." He ordered a lockdown of the area, deploying officers to search every inch of the property, every building, every possible hiding place. But deep down, we all knew it was futile. Emma hadn't been taken somewhere. She had been taken elsewhere. While the search was underway, Officer Miller and I decided to re-examine the diaries, searching for any clue, any hint that might shed light on Emma's disappearance and her connection to the past. We focused on Margaret Ainsworth's diary, specifically the final entry, the one that described her plan to seal the entity within the hidden room. As we reread the entry, we noticed something we had missed before. Margaret had mentioned a specific object, an amulet, that she had used in the ritual. She described it as a key, a ward, a protector. She believed that the amulet was essential to maintaining the seal, to preventing the entity from escaping. The amulet, Officer Miller said, her voice filled with a sudden realization. Where is it? Did Margaret leave it in the room? We returned to the first hidden room, the one above the cavern, and searched it thoroughly. We examined every inch of the floor, the walls, the ceiling, but there was no sign of the amulet. Then, I remembered something. The second hidden room, the cavern. We hadn't searched it thoroughly. We had been too focused on Emma, on the immediate threat. The cavern, I said. The amulet. It might be down there. Officer Miller nodded, her eyes filled with a grim determination. We have to go back. We knew it was dangerous, that we were risking our own lives, but we couldn't leave Emma to her fate. We had to try to find her, to save her, even if it meant facing the darkness again. We descended the stairs into the cavern, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The whispering was still there, a constant, unsettling presence, but it seemed different, less chaotic, more focused. We approached the pit, the source of the whispering, our hearts pounding in our chests. We shone our flashlights down into the darkness, but we still couldn't see the bottom. It was as if the pit were infinite. Then Officer Miller, who was inspecting the walls near the stairs, called, "I found it. Look, we found marks, drawings on the wall." It looked like a ritual of some kind, with symbols, and in the middle of the symbols, a draw of an amulet, but the draw was scratched. Like someone had removed the amulet from there. We searched the rest of the cavern, carefully examining every nook and cranny, every crevice, every shadow. As we did, a chilling realization dawned on me. Sarah White. She had claimed to be from 1923, the same era as Margaret Ainsworth, and she had described Emma's house in detail, as it had been then. Sarah White, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She wasn't a victim. She was a messenger. Officer Miller looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion. What do you mean?